fellow travelers. Yeah, I know I'm being recorded, thank you. Some of you are fellow travelers and have been promoting basic income for many years, but I'd like to remind us all that the principle of a right to subsistence, a right to a basic income, if you like, was established by the Charter of the Forest, which was enacted in 1217 in Britain. And the Charter of the Forest basically said that everybody has the right to subsistence living in the commons. And the commons gives us our connection to nature, our connection to a way of living and commoning, which is geared to reproduction of our environment, our nature, our resources, and ourselves. And then basic income is a right to reproduce ourselves, a right to live in a commons. And of course, that right has been compromised and taken away by the development of capitalism, particularly in the last 50 years or so of rampant neoliberalism and rentier capitalism. And I think in that context, where we have an ecological disaster rushing towards us, we have to think what measures can arrest this rush to extinction. And we must think in terms of reviving the commons, restoring the commons, and penalizing those who are taking the commons, and in taking the commons are destroying nature and our reproductive capabilities as societies. And in that context, we need a set of levies or taxes on all activities that are polluting, that are taking away the commons. But the trouble with them, as the Gilets jaunes experience of Macron found, is that if you go in the direction of carbon taxes, ecological taxes, cruise liner taxes, or any other taxes that are on global warming issues, then potentially it's going to be regressive, because the low-income groups are going to be penalized proportionately more than the wealthy. And the only way to make carbon taxes politically popular and efficient is to recycle the revenue gained from those taxes in the form of a basic income. Then you get popular support. I live in Switzerland, where we have a pollution tax, but it's also paid out in part each year in a tax refund for people. So it's very popular. And we need that sort of tax. Now, the trouble with the levies is that you need them to be very steep in order to have an impact that is desirable. We must tax those who are taking and using fossil fuels and other forms of pollution to a much greater extent. But here, I think, is another aspect of the link between the ecological issues, and I'm a green left person, or green-blue, because it extends to the commons in the sea. We need to tax the pollution of the sea as much as the pollution of the land. Much less attention is given to the blue commons as the green commons. I've just finished a book on the blue commons and saying how we would address those issues in the marine economy. But to do this, we have to think back to the sort of issues that many of us in the basic income movement have been thinking about over the years, which is what behavioral impact will a basic income have on ordinary people like you and me? And the first and most important one is it will enable people to make better choices between the type of work they undertake. It will enable people to spend more time on caring for those they love, more time for caring for the community in which they live, more time for caring for nature and interacting and getting to know nature. And in getting to know nature better, we want to preserve it. We value it more. One of the magical issues that came up during the COVID pandemic last year is it reconnected a lot more people with nature. And I think we need a slow time movement to go with a basic income movement, which will give people basic security and more freedom to care. And this combination of features will strengthen a sense of social solidarity and nature solidarity, make us appreciate that we are all part of an ecosystem. And the wonderful German or Prussian thinker of the early 19th century, Alexander Humboldt, he was the first to understand this connection between humanity and nature, and he inspired Darwin and so on. And a basic income is a way of reconnecting us as a society and as an ecosystem with nature. And that is why I think the two things are coming together. To end my comments, let me say that last year I made a video with Massive Attack, and it's been viewed and it's been translated into German, Italian, and Spanish, and so on. It's been viewed by 500,000 people. And the essence of that message was that a basic income will give us resilience. And we need resilience in order to fight the threat of extinction and the threat of rentier capitalism. And we've learned from this pandemic that if any of us lack resilience, all of us lack resilience. And that is why a basic income and the ecological movement are natural partners. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Guy. Thanks so much. I had 3 questions prepared, and one of them was partially answered already, and I'm definitely going to ask this one as the first one, and that is the following. So you mentioned that there's a need to tax, let's say, natural resources in general, or the usage of natural resources, or as you put it, like the commons. So a tax for things that originally belong to all of us, because they're used and we are all suffering from their usage, so we should gain something from it. So there, I think the direction is very clear, that there's money coming from these taxes, but then it's distributed equally among everybody of like a given society. So that's the idea of the basic income. But then you mentioned something which basically goes in the other way around, which is the basic income, once it's realized, would then enable people to reconnect to nature. Now, I am like, let's say, I'm a strong believer that this would be the case. I'm very much like convinced that this is the case. But I also see people who'd say, well, maybe if you give people some amount of money so they get by, like a little more like a basic income, you don't know what they spend it on, plus you don't know whether they'll reconnect to nature in any way. How do you argue against people like criticizing this point?
Well, first of all, I think we should realize that taxing those who take the commons and compensating the commoners who have been losing the commons is a matter of common justice. It's a matter of justice. What people do with their basic income is a separate issue. It's still a matter of justice that the people who should be receiving and using the commons, who are deprived of the commons, should be compensated for that. And ever since Justinian law, ancient Roman law of 734 AD, Justinian law said that the air is a commons, the water is a commons, sea is a commons. It belongs to nobody, but it belongs to everybody. And it is unjust if a minority makes profit from depriving us of good air, or depriving us of good water, or depriving us of the resources in the sea, as they're doing with mining and so on. So in other words, it's a matter of justice. But then it comes to the evidence. Basic income in experiments, in some of which I've been involved with doing myself and with others, basic income leads to people doing more care work, more environmental work, less polluting activities, more activities in the community. And these are practical experiences of people. But it's up to them. It's a question of freedom. I trust the human condition. And I think we should all trust the human condition. We all have an inherent desire to improve the lives of those we love, our communities, and our society. It's perverted by capitalism, but we still preserve those values. And that is what we're talking about.
Thanks so much. Great. My second question is the following. I think this is what I actually asked in December 2020 already. So that was our little conversation there. And I'd like to go down like a little deeper in there, which is, if you think about the climate movement and the basic income movement, they could as well just exist like right next to each other and not have much interaction. And my question is, do you think it'd be desirable that they joined forces, because their joint force is then more than the sum of its parts?
Of course, it would be much stronger if they could join forces. The trouble we have at the moment is that the green movement is split. It's split between people who believe that you can continue with economic growth of GDP and somehow decouple the threat to the environment from economic growth. This is the geoengineering approach. Some people believe that, like Bill Gates and people like that. I think this is false and misleading to pretend that we can have more and more economic growth of GDP and still manage to preserve the environment. We need to slow down. We need to focus on preserving nature, conserving our energies, conserving all forms of energy, not consuming more energy, reducing the consumption of energy. And it means a lifestyle change. That's what we need. I feel very suspicious of the movements for a Green New Deal, somehow imagining that you can generate hundreds of thousands of green jobs, as if that is going to solve the ecological crisis or the insecurity crisis. We have a multiple type of crisis in which millions and millions of people are in the precariat, suffering from chronic insecurity. And that is part of the crisis. And generating a whole lot more jobs will not lead to a better society and a better way of living. It will be the same old system with certain industrialists pretending that they're conserving energy, etc., etc. We need to change the way we live. And it is that degree of crisis that we're facing.
Great, thanks so much. You already mentioned a very important point that I was about to raise with my third question, and that pertains Green New Deals in plural here, because I mean, they're multiple in the sense that the European Union comes up with one. There's one promoted by the movements in the US, and they might be very different, but at their core, they obviously want some sort of green change. But what also comes with it in at least the case of the American Green New Deal, is the idea of a job guarantee. And that reminded me a little bit of the discussion that happened, I think, just a few years ago in the UK between universal basic services and universal basic income. Could you maybe comment on why you think, on the one hand, universal basic income is better than universal basic services, but also make a comment on why it might be hard to, let's say, implement some sort of job guarantee, even in green sectors.
Let me start with universal basic services. I read the documents produced by those people advocating UBS, as it's been called, in great detail. And I would use the word fraud. Their agenda is a fraud. Do they guarantee universal basic food for everybody? Turns out, no, they don't. Well, that's pretty basic. And in fact, that's basically what they pursued in the Soviet Union and in Maoist China. The very idea of having basic food guaranteed for everybody leads to an image where the food quality would be abysmal, and you would have to be grateful for what you were given. You wouldn't have a choice of type of food, you would have to be grateful. Even if the bread was stale or the meat was old, as the case was in the Soviet Union, where I was working at the end of the 1980s. And the idea of a universal basic transport, it turns out all they were talking about is free bus rides. Well, supposing you don't want to take a bus, you actually want to go on a bicycle, or you want to go on a metro or a train, well, you don't get that guaranteed. So basically, once you get to it, the details, it dissolves in whatever it is. And it's very paternalistic, because it means some state bureaucrat is going to be deciding on what is your basic need, your basic service, and you will be grateful for that. But you may not have those particular needs or desires. And that I think is fundamentally wrong, and it leads to parasitic sort of behavior. When it comes to the job guarantee, what sort of job are you going to guarantee me? I would like to be a Prime Minister of Britain. I think I would do a better job than Boris Johnson. Are you going to guarantee me that job? Of course not. Okay. What sort of job is going to be guaranteed? And supposing you as an individual say, well, look, whatever the job you're guaranteeing me, I don't want that job. I want to do something else. Oh, well, you're being guaranteed a job. You better be grateful. Again, it's paternalism, and it leads to workfare. Because basically, if you said, no, I will not take that guaranteed job, you would lose your benefits. So for me, it's another act of the state fraudulently offering something which sounds nice, but when you open it up and you look at it, what is being guaranteed, then it dissolves, because it would lead very quickly to workfare, to coercion, to sanctions, and pushing people into jobs that would be lowering the wages of others who were doing those jobs in the free labor market, because they would be subsidized instead. So that would have distortionary effects in the labor market. Once you open it up, as I've discussed in detail in a book called Battling Eight Giants, I've got appendix on the job guarantee and appendix on universal basic services. And you look at what people have actually said in their proposals, I think they're fraudulent alternatives to a basic income.
All right, thank you very much. That's it for now from my side, and I'd like to open up the discussion to the audience. So I think we can, just start asking Guy the questions that remain. You could, please just raise your hand by some sign, like a star, an asterisk or something in the chat, and then I'll unmute you so that you can ask your question. Do we have a question already?
I see comments on the chat.
There is one by Hans-Florian Heuer. The job guarantee is a disguised guarantee for means of payment. Why not just payment means then?
Sounds to me as if you're saying we should have a basic income, which is a good idea.
All right, and now I see hands. That's great. The first one was Mechthild. I'm trying to unmute you. That works. I think that works now. Mechthild.
Yeah, thank you. Guy Standing, you made an argument which is very common in the basic income movement, in my opinion, and I want to call it the justice argument. By saying we must tax and redistribute the commons, you're basically saying it's the right thing to do, it's a matter of justice. And I agree with you. Nevertheless, I believe that politics does most of the time not work along the lines of justice. You know, if politics would just realize justice arguments, the world would already look much different from the way it does today. So in my opinion, there's also a power argument, and the basic income movement is neglecting the side that justice will not, you know, automatically end up in realizing the basic income. So what's your point on, you know, power relations or the matter of power, and how does that come into how does that come into your picture or your idea of promoting the movement and realizing finally basic income as an institution?
Yeah, it's a very, very good comment and question. And I've addressed it in my books, particularly in The Corruption of Capitalism. And I always say that a basic income is not a panacea. It is not a single policy that will solve all our problems. It is only a necessary component of a progressive strategy. And you have touched your finger or voice on the key other aspect. We need to revive collective voice, representation. And I think the word revolt is one that I've used a lot. We need collective revolt. And one of the reasons I've been writing about the precariat and talking to precariat groups all over the world is that the precariat offers the hope of a collective movement, particularly young educated people, particularly women who are in the precariat, who have a common set of challenges, insecurities, and a common set of values often, that they want to see a slower time movement. They want to see more security. They want to see a revival of the commons. They want all these things. And I believe we are seeing the beginnings of a movement led by the precariat, which will be different from the social democrats of the 19th and 20th century. That social democracy in that model of laborism is dead. They are dead men walking. We need a green left, which is reviving through focusing on the precariat as providing the collective energy and anger that will get change. Because I totally agree with you that we need to look at power. But justice is always got to be motivating that collective action. We need justice and we demand justice. And that's always been the approach of progressive movements. And if you look back through history, whether it's in Germany or in Britain, you look back at history and most of the great revolts that have taken place are about recovering the commons. That's what motivated Karl Marx back in the 1830s, when he saw that the peasants were mobilizing because they were losing the commons. It's the same with the peasants' revolt in Britain and the various movements in Britain. They have been a movement about recovering the commons, because that unites people, enough people. And I totally agree with your question, but I don't think one should say that because basic income is not directly linked to power, that we should be thinking of not including it in our strategy.
All right, thank you very much, Mechtel, for your question and Guy for your answer. Next in line, I have Reinhard Huss. Up, where is he?
Reinhard. Can't see Reinhard. I see Falco. I see Falco.
No Reinhard right here. Daniel, can you help me?
I see a question from Annie Miller.
There's also, that's the one next in line, where maybe we'll just jump over that, and whenever Reinhard comes back, then yeah, he can ask his question. The question by Annie Miller was, what does the Green Movement think about a basic income?
Well, first of all, it's always a pleasure to be talking with Annie. Our friendship goes back many, many years. Let's leave it at that. And I also would like to congratulate her for the fact that tomorrow begins the next Bien Congress, or conference and then Congress, which this year is being held in Glasgow. And there are hundreds of presentations and there are hundreds of participants. Anybody can register to participate. And I'm very pleased that Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister, is going to give a speech at that conference. Now, as Annie knows, the Green Movement has been fantastically supportive of a basic income in many, many countries, including Britain. And I've been invited to speak to their congresses several times in recent years. And their one and only Green Member of Parliament, Caroline Lucas, is a very, very strong supporter of a basic income. And I think that members of the Greens are understanding of why we need a basic income for the reasons that I've given. And I'm delighted that they are openly advocating it as a prominent policy.
Thank you so much, Guy. Thank you so much, Annie, for your answer, for your question. I see Falco Weichselbaum with the next question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Guy, for being here. It's a pleasure. So for me, one of the actually key arguments, if I see this connection of the climate movement and basic income, is that we need to degrowth our economy in a sense that we need to be very careful about our resources on our planet. And you pretty good explained how this taxation of the profits, when someone is doing profits by doing I need to think about it by
Taking from the commons.
Yeah.
So
When we try to finance the basic income with this technique, I think that critics are fastly on the point that on one hand, with the basic income, we try to degrowth economy, but then how does it work that we make a taxation on this profits of the commons? I think that fastly comes up, but how can you, what is your answer to them?
I think, can I answer now? Yes. I think the idea is to build a commons fund along the lines of the Norwegian pension fund or the Alaska Permanent Fund from taxing pollution, taxing land, taxing rental incomes, and pooling that money and then recycling it. The point about degrowth is to say we do not make the pursuit of GDP growth the priority. On the contrary, we do not follow that logic. What we do follow is a logic of strengthening living standards and the conservation of our resources and the conservation of our way of living. And in that regard, you see, what happens when you recycle income in the form of a basic income is that people spend it on basic goods and services in their local communities. Okay, it doesn't increase GDP growth, but it enables people to have more vegetables, more fruit, more services, more access to community health situations, which are not actually measured in GDP very well. All the work that women do in caring for their children and their loved ones and elderly relatives for no pay is not counted in our GDP measures. But occasionally, the statistical office of the country goes out and measures the value of unpaid care. And in Britain, they did a big national survey, and they found out that the value of unpaid care, which is not polluting at all, but which is improving living standards of those people receiving and giving the care, the value of that unpaid care was greater than the value of all manufacturing and all non-financial services that were creating jobs. So we need to be thinking of a different way of looking at what we want to measure, what we want to value. I think providing and receiving care is extremely valuable, but the measures of economic growth give it zero. It's ridiculous. It's sexist. And every feminist should be furious that that is the reality in 2021, especially in the light of COVID, where we saw care work had to be done by millions and was valuable for that. So for me, this is the big existential question we have in front of us is, what is it we want instead of GDP growth? Because I don't want GDP growth. Do you? You don't even know what it is? Most people don't. I'm not saying you do, but I'm just saying most people don't know what it is, but their governments and politicians always talking about GDP growth. We must increase GDP growth. Why? Why? You could increase GDP growth by building more nuclear guns, nuclear armaments. Do you want to do that? I don't. So to me, we need to be thinking of looking at life and looking at society in a different way. And basic income and the ecological movements are both saying that.
All right, thanks so much. We have 3 more questions I see now, maybe a 4th one. No, that's just reminding me that Reinhard is back. So he is now able to ask his question. Reinhard, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, certainly can.
My internet is very unstable today, so I'm getting on and off. And it was actually a follow-up to this question of power, because I feel, I mean, ecological taxes, I fully agree, but, and I agree also with the revolt, but I think if a basic income is introduced and paid through ecological taxes, we need institutions which we are actually in control of, so that it is actually continued and not hijacked by politicians. I put it in the short phrase, we are the state, but we are not in control of the state. So I don't know whether Guy has any suggestions, because if we raise taxes and the taxes are used for other purposes or for some time for basic income and then it's reduced or abolished because politicians change their mind. Yeah, so we need some institutions where we are really in control of and which cannot be easily overturned. Thank you.
Please, Guy.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's good to see you again, Reinhard, and I hope you're well, and it's always good to see you. The one I've proposed in my books, and particularly in the book The Plunder of the Commons, is that the levies or taxes on pollution and land and wealth should go into an independent commons capital fund based along the Norwegian model, but democratically run outside the control of the government of the day. It should be a democratic institution that determines how much can be paid out as a basic income in order to make it equitable in one crucial respect. You have to remember that whatever system of basic income is introduced, it must respect the principle of intergenerational equity. And that means that the commons, the value of the commons, must be preserved for future generations as much as for current generations. So it would be unjust if you use the commons fund to pay out everybody as much as possible who's voting now. They have to respect the intergenerational equity and preserve the capital value of the fund and distribute what is available and is going to be replenished in the fund through the levies from year to year. And that fund should be independently run, democratically governed, and be set up as a constitutional mechanism. And I think then you meet the points you're making, Reinhard, which I have a lot of sympathy, but I think that you can answer these questions.
Thank you. We had one question in the chat, which was directed towards all. So I assume that includes Guy. So I'm just gonna ask that to Guy. So this one was, who knows good papers on the effect of a UBI in the individual environmental behavior? So, I mean, the question would just be, Guy, many things that you just said, are they also, let's say, researched? Are there experiments showing exactly what you say, in the sense that once you provide a UBI, people behave positively towards the environment, towards nature in general? Is there a lot of evidence to support this?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence, and there have now been a lot of pilots, experiments. You're listening to someone who has the crazy habit of having been involved in doing basic income pilots in 4 continents, and also helping analyze experiments done by others. And I think that the universal findings include improved mental and physical health, which is an ecological issue as well, because better health means better behavior and lower demands on public resources. But it also leads to people spending more time in caring for their relatives. It leads in developing countries to a reduction in child labor, and therefore more schooling and more benefits from schooling. It leads to improvements in women's status and the sense of independence of women. And women tend to be much more ecologically oriented in their behavior, in their sentiments, and in their activities. And it leads to more work of a type that we would like, rather than just seeking jobs at any price. So for me, the evidence is very strong. I've summarized that in my books, and I think the evidence now is overwhelming. It includes findings which the World Bank have supported, which shows that if you have basic, the consumption of private bads like alcohol and tobacco goes down, not up. And that, I think, is a minor aspect of a more ecological way of living. And the reasons I believe are very strong too, why people actually does this change take place. And I won't have time now to go into that, but they're explained in the book. But generally speaking, a basic income induces people to behave better. They don't have to be so opportunistic and so bitter and so angry that they can slow down. And surely that's what we want.
All right, thanks so much. We have another question in the chat, which is by text. I saw another one by Hans-Florian Heuer, and then also Reinhard, whose hand is up. Is that again or still up, Reinhard? Just to know whether you wanted to say something. First the question by text, but maybe you can think about your question.
It was just sort of, there is a paper about work and ecological footprint, which says the less people work in the formal economy, the lower is their ecological footprint. I mean, this is an argument for reduced working hours, but I think it could be easily transferred to the basic income idea.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much. Maybe you can post this.
I put it in the chat, and I have to say goodbye because I have another meeting. Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Text question was, are those who would benefit much from a basic income favorable towards it? E.g., so do the Gilets jaunes activists, in your experience, support it?
Well, we had a very interesting debate at a basic income conference in Finland in 2019, just after the Gilets jaunes movement and started. And some members of the Gilets jaunes came to that meeting to explain their position. And they were all very supportive of a basic income. I think you have to realize that the Gilets jaunes was a movement against a regressive tax by itself. And I think they were justified. I really think they were justified. Gilets jaunes was basically saying we need more justice in society. And they were protesting at a government that was not going in that direction, and they were justified. So I think they supported basic income, and that would be a natural position for them to take.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks so much. There is another question by Hans-Florian Heuer, and that is, where was it? Do we need to consciously look at the social contract again to embed the UBI well?
I'm always a little skeptical about the idea of a social contract. First of all, it's not a contract because it's not legally binding. So a better word would be compact, a social compact. But I'm wondering on whose terms such a social compact would be built. If it's a social compact which says that we want to give more security in return for less economic growth, I think that's great. If we want a social compact which says that the threat of extinction means we have to thoroughly reorient our economic system to preserving resources, to providing security, to reducing inequality, to reducing insecurity, I'm all in favor of that. How we get it goes back to the first question about justice. We need a movement to demand that, and getting away from having governments run by financial institutions like the British one, like the Americans, like the Italians, all run by financiers who from Goldman Sachs and various other big financial institutions. We'll never get a proper social compact while we have governments run by those financial institutions, and that we must change. But until we can change that, until we have a powerful social movement, political movement, demanding the sort of things we're talking about, then a social compact is not really meaningful. But I believe it's a good idea.
Mm-hmm. We have one more comment by Eva from Poland. I'm just going to read this out, although it's a little longer, but I think there are like some really interesting points in there. And that is, thanks a lot for this meeting. I sign 100% under the ideas of Guy, even if in the Polish Green Movement, as in other post-communist countries, it is not the dominant position. 30 years of neoliberalism as a medicine against communism formed people's minds. The new generations of 30-year-olds and younger will rebuild the sense of social justice. But for the moment, in majority people consider as just recompensance for someone's efforts. But the recognition of UBI is slowly progressing. I believe that it will continue to progress with the growing impacts of climate and ecological disasters and the permanent crisis. So I think for me, what is really important here is the idea that in post-communist countries, it might be even harder to get to convince a large part of society of basic income. What is your experience there?
Well, first of all, my books have been translated into Polish, and before the pandemic, I was invited a number of times to come to Poland and have done virtual Zoom presentations in Poland in the past year and a half. And what I find is the young, educated Poles are very supportive of the sort of things we're talking about. They have an extreme right-wing government, very nativist Catholic and paternalistic, that is a residual neoliberalism that is quite parasitic in its character. But I think that underneath it, there is an emerging energy in Poland that is actually very progressive, and the intellectual capacities in Poland are fantastic. So that I think in the next few years, you will see a breakthrough for the Greens, for the left, for basic income. And of course, there's a very large precariat in Poland. They understand the precariat in Poland. And that I think it augurs well for the future.
Great, thanks so much. I don't see any more questions. I think we can
see everybody's going, and I think that's good. We've had more than an hour.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we can wrap up here. But for everybody, anybody who is interested in this overlap between the climate movement, but then also the basic income movement, they'll find not only the article by Guy Standing, but also by other authors very much commenting on the same topics in the new edition of Green European Perspectives on Basic Income. And I'm happy to send this around, or rather, you contact me or us, and then I have your email so that I can send it around. But I wanted to thank Guy for, showing up today and explaining his view on this overlap, the differences, but also parallels between a basic income and the climate movement. I think it's a very important issue that we're going to hear more about in the future. So maybe there's just going to be a new edition of this meeting sometime next year, and we'll see some updates on that. Guy, do you have any last words that you want to share with us?
No, I apologize again for being late. I'm in Italy, and the Italians are always late. But I thank you for listening, and I think it's a great conversation we've got to continue. So I wish you all well. I wish you well.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody, for showing. And could I ask you, Guy, to stay on for 2 more minutes, because I have one more question, and then I'll let you off. All right. Thank you, everybody.